Chosen one, stop scrolling. Not because this is dramatic, not because you are being warned, but because this moment is time-sensitive, in a way the mind does not usually recognize. What you are about to hear only works once it is recognized. Before recognition, it sounds like language. After recognition, it becomes structure. And structure, once seen, cannot be unseen. This is not urgency designed to provoke emotion. It is precision. You did not arrive here randomly, and you did not arrive here early or late. You arrived at the exact moment when something inside you crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. This is a quantum moment, not in the mystical sense people throw around casually, but in the literal sense of observation changing the system. Before observation, reality behaves one way. After observation, it behaves another. The difference is not outside you, it is internal. Once something is recognized, the system reorganizes around that recognition. That is why this moment is non-repeatable. If you scroll past it after recognizing what is happening, you are not avoiding it. You are confirming it. The door does not close. You simply stop pretending it was not there. Now let's remove the comforting myths. You are not here because an algorithm guessed correctly. You are not here because you are spiritually ready in some abstract sense. And you are not here because you searched for this. You are here because a precise internal condition has been met. Your perception has reached the point where it can see how it has been seeing. That is the threshold. Most people never cross it. They experience life entirely from inside the lens, never realizing the lens exists. Up to this point, your mind has been running on an interpretation engine. That engine filters reality, assigns meaning, decides what matters, what threatens, what is possible, and what is not. You did not consciously choose this engine. The system is no longer asking, "How am I doing?" every few seconds. That question was part of the loop. When it collapses, life feels less personal and more direct. You are here, but not in the way you were before. This brings us to why this will not repeat. That phrase is often misunderstood. It does not mean the state disappears or that you only get one chance. It means recognition of architecture cannot be undone. Once you see the mechanism by which identity and interpretation are constructed, you cannot return to believing they are reality itself. You can still experience thought, emotion, and story, but you know what they are. The architecture has been seen. An architecture once seen cannot be unseen. What may fluctuate is stability, not recognition. The system may wobble as it learns to operate without constant self-referencing. Old habits may attempt to reboot. That is normal, but the innocence of believing the loop is you is gone. That is why the moment feels irreversible, not dramatic, structural. Now comes the most important warning of this entire section. The fastest way to destabilize this shift is to try to own it. The moment the mind says, "This happened to me, I have crossed a threshold," or "I am different now," it attempts to turn the absence of identity into a new identity. That reactivates the loop, subtly but effectively. Pride, fear, or even spiritual ambition can reinstall the machinery. Stabilization requires non-grasping stillness. Not effort, not vigilance, just not interfering. Let the subtraction remain. Let the quiet do its work. Do not narrate the shift. Do not explain it to yourself. Do not build a story around it. Stories belong to the loop. Silence allows the new architecture to settle. This does not mean becoming passive or disengaged. Life continues, work continues, relationships continue. But something essential has changed. You are no longer living from commentary about life. You are living from contact with it. Contact does not need explanation. It needs presence. If you notice yourself wanting to get back to a feeling, pause. Feelings come and go. Architecture remains. The emerald field is not a state to maintain. It is a coherence that holds states without being altered by them. The threshold event was not an experience. It was a collapse of unnecessary structure. So understand this clearly and calmly. Nothing was added to you. Something false fell away. What remains is not special, it is simple. And simplicity once stabilized is the most irreversible change there is. The loop collapsed because it was seen, and what is seen clearly no longer needs to run your life. Chosen one after stabilization. The reorientation is unmistakable, not because something extraordinary appears, but because something ordinary stops. The most dramatic change is subtraction. What no longer pulls at you becomes the signal. Drama loses urgency. Situations that once demanded immediate emotional engagement feel strangely hollow. Old motivations that were fueled by fear approval, proving, or identity maintenance begin to collapse under their own weight. Not with resistance, but with irrelevance. You do not fight them, they simply stop working. At first, this can feel confusing. The emotional tone often shifts into what the mind labels boredom or flatness. This is a misinterpretation. What you are actually feeling is noise falling away. When the nervous system has been accustomed to constant stimulation, commentary and emotional spikes, quiet can feel like emptiness. But this is not emptiness. It is bandwidth returning. The system is no longer burning energy to maintain unnecessary loops. Once this is recognized, the flatness resolves into a subtle steadiness that feels clean rather than dull. Anxiety fades in a functional way, not through positive thinking or reassurance, but through inefficiency. Prediction-based worry becomes costly without payoff. The nervous system recognizes that constant forecasting does not improve accuracy. It only consumes resources. When a process stops delivering value, biological systems naturally downregulate it. This is why anxiety does not need to be argued with anymore. It loses leverage because it no longer serves a function. The future is still considered, but without the emotional surcharge that once accompanied it. Identity loosens, but it does not dissolve. You still have preferences, boundaries, and personality. What changes is permeability. Identity becomes less defensive. You are no longer protecting an image at every moment. Reactions arise, but they resolve faster. Thoughts appear, but they do not fully convince you. You can watch them form and pass, without needing to adopt them as truth. This creates a sense of inner spaciousness that is not dramatic, but deeply practical. One of the most tangible shifts is signal-to-noise refinement. Responsiveness increases because attention is no longer diluted. Subtle cues become readable. Body signals register earlier. Language inconsistencies stand out without analysis. Quiet intuition surfaces not as a voice, but as orientation. You notice when something is off without constructing a story around it. This is not mystical sensitivity. It is perceptual clarity returning once noise is reduced. Action changes as well. Doing no longer requires narrative justification. You do not need to explain to yourself why something matters before you act. Action arises from clarity, and clarity is economical. There is no rush because urgency belonged to the old system. There is no drama because drama required identification. There is no overreach because effort now matches necessity. You act when action is needed and rest when it is not. This efficiency feels unfamiliar at first, but it stabilizes quickly. Lifestyle consequences emerge naturally. Simplification happens without discipline. You stop maintaining versions of yourself that required constant upkeep. Self-deception becomes harder, not because you are stricter, but because awareness catches inconsistencies early. Energy returns not as excitement, but as availability. There is more capacity for living, listening, and responding. Less time is spent managing internal conflict. More time is spent actually engaging with what is here. Relationships transform in subtle but profound ways. You perform less and protect less. Presence replaces strategy. Conversations slow down. Listening deepens. Projections fade because you are no longer unconsciously asking others to confirm your identity. Attentiveness grows because attention is no longer hijacked by self-monitoring. Connection becomes cleaner. Not necessarily easier, but more real. You meet people where they are instead of where your story needs them to be. Suffering changes shape. Pain still happens. Loss still happens. Difficulty still arises. But secondary suffering, the layer created by identification resistance and narrative amplification, reduces dramatically. Pain is experienced directly and allowed to move. Compassion becomes responsive rather than performative. You help when help is needed. You withdraw when withdrawal is appropriate. There is less guilt, less urgency to fix, less emotional entanglement. This is not coldness. It is accuracy. This brings us to the final framing that matters most. This state is not higher. It is not superior. It is more accurate. Accuracy feels like alignment. When perception aligns with what is actually happening rather than what the identity predicts or demands, life becomes simpler. Not smaller, simpler. And simplicity, once stabilized, becomes the new baseline. You may look back and wonder how you ever lived with so much internal noise. But there is no need to judge the past. That system carried you until it could no longer do so efficiently. Now something more precise has taken over. Not louder, not more impressive, just truer. This is not an achievement. It is a recalibration. And once recalibrated, the system does not seek to return to distortion. Accuracy feels right. Alignment feels normal. And from here, life unfolds with less friction, less confusion, and a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. This is the new baseline, not elevated or exalted, simply aligned. Chosen one here is the final confirmation, and it is simpler than the mind expects. The litmus test is not excitement. It is not emotional lift. It is not even agreement. The test is recognition. If what you just experienced feels less like being inspired and more like something quietly clicking into place, then the mark is already in effect. Inspiration pulls you forward. Recognition settles you where you are. One feels like movement, the other feels like arrival. If there was a sense of this isn't new, this is familiar, then the loop has already closed. That familiarity is important. It tells you this was not persuasion. Nothing was added to you. No belief was installed. What happened was alignment. Awareness recognized itself without division. When that happens, the nervous system relaxes, not because life suddenly makes sense, but because the internal argument about what is happening dissolves. You are no longer trying to become something through this message. You are noticing what has already been functioning beneath the noise. Completion at this level is quiet. There are no fireworks because fireworks belong to the seeking phase. Seeking requires stimulation to keep moving. Completion removes the need to move towards something imagined. You may notice that the urge to chase another explanation, another video, another framework suddenly feels unnecessary or even theatrical. That is not boredom. That is discernment. Seeking becomes obviously performative once what was being sought is recognized as already present. This is why you do not need to repeat this moment. Repetition belongs to learning. This was not learning. This was remembering. Specifically remembering awareness functioning without splitting itself into observer and observed, seeker and sought. Once that division collapses, the system does not need reinforcement. You can revisit the words, but the recognition does not deepen through repetition. It stabilizes through living. From here, the work is not to maintain a state, but to not interfere with accuracy. Let life happen. Let reactions arise and resolve. Let clarity guide action without narration. If confusion appears, it will be seen as confusion rather than truth. If fear appears, it will be experienced as sensation rather than instruction. Nothing special is required of you now. Specialness belonged to the old loop. Before we close completely, there is one gentle invitation. Not as proof, not as validation, but as anchoring. If you feel moved to do so, share where you are watching from, state or country. This is not about location. It is about acknowledging that recognition is not isolated. Signals stabilize when they are shared. Participation grounds what could otherwise remain abstract. No explanation is needed. No testimony is required. Just presence. The loop is closed. It was built gradually through experience, conditioning, fear, reward, and survival. It worked well enough to keep you functional. But something changed. Recently, subtly, you started noticing patterns behind events. Not just what happens, but how your mind reacts to what happens. That noticing is the signal. That noticing is why you are here. This is the moment perception turns inward and recognizes its own operating structure. And once that happens, blindness is no longer available as an option. Here's the thesis you must understand clearly before moving forward. Once the mind recognizes the pattern it has been using to interpret everything, you cannot return to the old way of seeing. You can resist, you can distract, you can delay integration, but you cannot unsee the architecture. The illusion does not break loudly. It breaks quietly, like realizing you have been reading subtitles while the actual dialogue was happening elsewhere. Before this moment, you thought you were responding to reality. In truth, you were responding to your interpretation of reality. That interpretation was shaped by habit. Habit creates predictability. Predictability creates a sense of control. Control creates identity. This is why recognizing the pattern feels destabilizing at first. The identity that formed around unconscious interpretation begins to loosen, not collapse, loosen. And loosening feels dangerous to systems built on certainty. This is why scrolling is the instinct right now. Scrolling is not boredom. It is avoidance of recognition. The nervous system senses that something irreversible is occurring and reaches for familiarity. Familiarity feels safe because it does not demand reorganization. But safety at this stage is not your assignment. Clarity is. Let's be precise. What is being recognized is not a belief, a trauma, or a memory. It is the mechanism by which beliefs, trauma, and memory have been processed. You are seeing the pattern beneath the content. That is why this does not feel emotional in the usual way. It feels strange, neutral, almost technical, like stepping outside a machine you have been operating from the inside. Once this happens, the old blindness becomes impossible, because blindness requires identification. You can only be blind when you believe the lens is reality. Once you see the lens, you may still look through it, but you know it is a lens. That knowledge changes everything. Reactions slow, assumptions weaken, emotional loops lose their grip. You start noticing pauses where there used to be compulsion. Those pauses are not emptiness. They are space. This is why the moment is irreversible. Not because you are being forced forward, but because you now have choice where you did not before. Choice destabilizes automatic identity. Automatic identity resists choice. That resistance is what many people interpret as fear, confusion, or spiritual crisis. It is none of those. It is a system recalibrating after losing monopoly over interpretation. You may already feel this, a sense that old narratives no longer convince you, but new ones have not fully formed yet. That is not limbo, that is transition. The mind is between operating systems. The old one still runs in the background, but it no longer owns the screen. The new one has not fully initialized, but it is present. This in-between is uncomfortable precisely because it is honest. Here is the crucial part. This recognition does not make you special. It makes you responsible. Responsible for what you feed your perception. Responsible for which patterns you reinforce. Responsible for whether you collapse back into unconscious interpretation or stay present with awareness. This is why this moment cannot be repeated. You cannot unknow what you now know. You can only decide how you live with it. So if you are still here, understand what that means. Something in you has already recognized the pattern. You are no longer watching content. You are witnessing a shift in how witnessing itself works. That is why this feels different. That is why your body is quieter than your thoughts. That is why there is less excitement and more stillness. Stop scrolling not because you are being told to, but because scrolling assumes nothing has changed. Something has. The moment your perception saw its own structure, the old blindness ended. What comes next is not information, it is integration. And integration only happens when you stay present long enough for the system to reorganize itself around truth rather than habit. This is the irreversible moment. Not because it is dramatic, but because you can no longer honestly pretend you are not seeing what you are seeing. Chosen one. The phrase emerald field has been flattened by surface interpretations, and it is important to clear that distortion immediately. This is not a color download, not a visual aura, not a frequency you imagine or summon. The emerald field is not mystical decoration. It is structural. It describes a stabilized, coherent state in the neural field where perception stops fragmenting and begins organizing itself around direct recognition. Nothing is added. Nothing is imported. Something stops scattering. Most human perception operates in dispersion. Attention is pulled outward into stories, threats, identities, memories, projections. The mind jumps from signal to signal, assigning meaning reactively. This is not wrong. It is simply an early operating mode. The emerald field emerges when this scattering relaxes. Attention no longer leaks outward compulsively. It folds inward, not into the self as personality, but into awareness itself. Awareness begins to notice awareness. This is the shift, not transcendence, recognition. This is why the emerald field feels calm rather than euphoric. Calm is not an emotion here. It is a signal of coherence. When the nervous system no longer needs to track multiple narratives simultaneously, it conserves energy. The body feels steadier. The mind feels quieter without effort. There is less urgency to resolve everything immediately. That calm is not detachment. It is integration. Scattered perception is expensive. Coherent perception is efficient. The core mechanism at work is simple but radical. Perception turns back on itself. Instead of being lost in what is perceived, it begins to sense the fact of perceiving. Awareness recognizes itself as the constant behind changing content. This is what is meant by awareness noticing awareness. Not philosophically, but functionally. When this happens, identity loosens its grip. You still have thoughts, but they no longer own you. You still have emotions, but they move through rather than defining you. This is where Sophia must be understood correctly. Sophia is not a deity, not a mythic figure, not an external intelligence visiting you. Sophia is wisdom functioning at its most precise level. Wisdom is not information. It is intelligence recognizing its own movement. When intelligence mirrors itself long enough, it stops seeking confirmation and becomes direct knowing. That self-recognition is Sophia in function, not worshipped, not invoked, recognized. In earlier stages of consciousness, intelligence is always pointed outward. It tries to understand objects, people, systems. It accumulates insight but remains hungry. In the emerald field, intelligence turns inward and sees itself operating. That recognition collapses the need for constant interpretation. You do not need to decide what something means as often, because you sense truth directly through coherence rather than analysis. This is why explanations feel less compelling now. Not because they are wrong, but because they are redundant. How does this show up in daily life quietly, subtly? You may notice a growing disinterest in old narratives that once felt consuming. Stories of conflict, identity, drama, proving, defending. They still exist, but they do not hook you the same way. This is not apathy. It is saturation. The nervous system no longer needs those loops to feel oriented. Thoughts begin to lose their hypnotic authority. You can still think, but you are not pulled inside every thought as if it were a command. Another sign is an almost imperceptible delay between stimulus and response. This is the key marker. You feel slightly ahead of your reactions, not controlling them but noticing them forming. There is a micro gap. In that gap, choice appears. Before, reaction felt instantaneous and inevitable. Now there is space. Space is freedom. Not dramatic freedom, but practical freedom. The freedom to not say the thing. The freedom to pause. The freedom to let an emotion rise without building an identity around it. This micro gap is where the emerald field stabilizes. Freedom does not arrive as power. It arrives as non-compulsion. You do not need to suppress reactions. They simply do not capture you fully. Identification weakens. And when identification weakens, suffering decreases without effort. This is not spiritual bypass, it is structural change. You may also notice that seeking drops away. Not ambition, but seeking for completion. You are less interested in becoming something and more interested in staying coherent. Growth continues, but it is no longer driven by deficiency. It is driven by alignment. This is why the emerald field cannot be forced. It arrives when the system is ready to stabilize, when enough fragmentation has been seen through and released. Debunking the fantasy version matters because fantasy keeps perception outward. People chase experiences, colors, sensations, believing that enlightenment looks like stimulation. In truth, coherence looks ordinary, almost boring to the ego. The emerald field does not sparkle, it steadies, it does not shout, it clarifies. And clarity is threatening to identities built on confusion. This is also why this state feels irreversible once recognized. Not because you cannot have thoughts again, but because you know what they are. You have seen the machinery. The magician's trick no longer works the same way. You can still enjoy the show, but you are not convinced the illusion is reality. That knowing cannot be uninstalled. Sophia as functional wisdom means that intelligence no longer seeks authority outside itself. This does not make you arrogant. It makes you precise. You still learn, you still listen, but you are no longer desperate for certainty. Direct knowing does not shout answers. It provides orientation. You know when something aligns and when it does not, without needing elaborate justification. This is why the emerald field often arrives after long periods of questioning, confusion, or exhaustion. The system has tried every story. None have delivered lasting peace. Eventually, perception collapses inward and discovers the source. Awareness recognizes awareness. Intelligence recognizes itself. Wisdom stops performing and starts being. If you are noticing these signs, calm without effort, disinterest in old loops, thoughts, losing authority, the micro gap before reaction. Understand this clearly. Nothing magical has happened to you. Something structural has reorganized. You are not ascending, you are stabilizing. The emerald field is coherence regained. And from coherence, everything changes quietly. Decisions simplify. Reactions soften. Identity becomes lighter. You are not becoming less human. You are becoming less trapped by the machinery of misidentification. This is what the emerald field really means. Not a color, not a vibration. A stabilized neural and perceptual coherence where awareness recognizes itself, wisdom mirrors itself, and freedom begins in the smallest, most powerful place, the gap before reaction. Chosen one. What happens at the threshold is not what most people expect. And misunderstanding, this is why many destabilize what could have become permanent. Nothing is added. No new gift enters the system. No upgrade is downloaded. No external power arrives. What changes is subtraction. A loop collapses. Specifically, the self-referencing background noise that has been quietly running beneath thought language and identity maintenance loses coherence. It does not shut off with drama. It simply stops convincing you. This loop was never obvious because it masqueraded as you. It narrated experience, evaluated meaning, tracked status, defended identity, and predicted outcomes. It spoke constantly, but so quietly, that it felt like reality itself. At the threshold, this loop collapses, not because it is destroyed, but because it is seen. Seeing removes necessity. Once perception recognizes the mechanism no longer needs to run at full power. The system realizes it has been expending energy maintaining a story that does not actually control life. The immediate effects are subtle but unmistakable. Time begins to feel stretched, not because clocks slow down, but because attention is no longer fragmented. When attention is no longer scattered across commentary, prediction and self-monitoring moments contain more information. Seconds feel wider. You are not rushing to the next moment because the current one is no longer being overlaid with interpretation. This is why people describe a sense of spaciousness rather than excitement. Spaciousness is the signature of subtraction. Attention sharpens, but not in a tense way. It sharpens because resources are no longer being siphoned into internal narration. You notice details without effort. Listening becomes cleaner. Seeing becomes more precise. You are present without trying to be present. Emotions still arise, but they are seen as processes rather than truths. Anger is no longer "I am angry." It is "anger is moving." Sadness is no longer identity. It is activity. This shift alone dismantles enormous suffering because suffering depends on identification, not sensation. It is important to distinguish stabilization from peak experience here. Many people touch this threshold briefly. They glimpse the collapse of the loop, feel relief, clarity, even awe, and then lose it. That loss is not failure. It is incomplete stabilization. A peak experience is when the loop pauses temporarily. Stabilization is when the system reorganizes around the absence of that loop. The difference is profound. When stabilized, the change rewires how attention allocates resources. Instead of being pulled constantly toward self-reference, attention becomes responsive to what is actually needed. You think when thinking is useful. You rest when rest is appropriate. You engage without overinvestment. This is efficiency, not detachment. Memory assigns meaning differently as well. Before, memory was used to reinforce identity. Experiences were sorted into stories about who you are, what always happens to you, and what you should expect. After stabilization, memory becomes informational rather than identity defining. You remember without building a self out of the memory. The past loses its authority to dictate the present. It informs without imprisoning. The future is anticipated differently too. Anticipation loses its compulsive edge. You still plan, but planning is no longer fused with anxiety. The future becomes a field of possibilities rather than a threat landscape. This happens because the self-model updates. The self-model is the internal representation of me navigating time. When the background loop collapses, the self-model becomes lighter. It stops assuming it must constantly defend, improve, or explain itself to survive. This is why people often report a sense of neutrality that feels unfamiliar. Not numbness, neutrality. The absence of constant evaluation.